Party people! Howdy. Back with ZwischenVid number 2. God, that's a stupid name. Okay, and well, let's get started. I'll show you how we reach the position that the position in question. So D4. If you guys haven't watched number 1, go and watch that. That sort of explains the premise, but a quick summary is I'm just giving you guys a position that is sort of random. You won't know what the theme is. It's one that I found instructive. It could be a raw calculation problem. It could be almost no calculation and based just on intuition. You kind of just have to go through your usual thinking process and select a move. And hopefully this is something you take seriously, and it's something that you use an amount of time that makes sense for the time controls that you play. So if you play long games, take 15 minutes. If you play usually blitz games, I wouldn't advise you to take like 1 minute, but do whatever you want and give it some thought and watch the video, pause it, think about it, or come back to it a day later, whatever, and see what you get. And it's basically just a way to tune up and correct your thought processes compared to players like me, or of course much better than me. This game is between white was a 2172 FIDE, Felix Tuomainen, and black was Georg Meyer, my coach. I wonder where I got this position from. Okay, so let's get started. Very quickly, I'm not going to go through much of the opening moves. Typical Georg stuff, but what do you do when you're facing a 2200 and you don't want to play maybe something as solid as the Queen's Gambit? Play the English defense, apparently. And knight f3 is a very natural move, but not the only one. More principled might be e4, when the new hotness in this line is bishop b7, bishop d3, not allowing knight c3, bishop b4 check, and king f1, hoping to prove that this bishop is a little bit loose. And in fact, most people are now retreating the bishop and putting it on f6 and then going knight to e7, but that's something totally different. It's also possible to just go a3 here and stop bishop b4 for good. Also not a bad move. Moving on, knight f3, bishop b7. Black controls these key center squares. G3, excuse me. An interesting move already, honestly, because anyone who looks at this position for 5 seconds can tell that bishop takes f3 is possible. And we'll see that in the game. So after bishop b4 check, white goes bishop d2. And Georg elects to take first, but it is possible to snap on f3 immediately. And yeah, it's an interesting moment. The database is pretty much split between queen d2 and knight d2, and it looks very natural to go knight d2, doesn't it? The problem with going knight b takes d2 is that in these structures, the knight is dramatically better on the c3 square. You could imagine, for instance, let's just say queen d2 and black doesn't take. In this position, of course, black can take, but let's just say I go knight to f6. After bishop g2, castles, knight to c3, let's say d6, or I guess d5 is possible. My point is this. Usually in these structures, white is very interested in going d5 himself, and having the queen on d2 and the open d file and the knight on c3 is much more conducive to going d5 and shutting this bishop out of the game for good. Whereas if you put the knight on the d2 square when you cast a capture, not only is the knight not placed on a square where it can support d5, but it also blocks the queen's view of that same square. So, and after something like maybe f5 or knight f6, white is going to find it hard to wrestle control of this e4 square. So, after queen takes d2, white is obviously, after bishop takes f3, e takes f3, trying to claim that having this an unopposed light squared bishop on the g2 square is more than adequate compensation for the fractured pawn structure in the center, the doubled f pawns, etc. And white's structure gets even worse because after d5, it's sort of hard to avoid something like d takes c4, or after c takes d5, queen takes d5, leaving white with both doubled f pawns and an isolated d-pawn, and that's exactly what happens in the game. White went knight to c3. Black goes knight g to e7. It's also possible to go knight to f6. I'm not sure in most cases if there's any difference. The one advantage to this is that if for some reason white doesn't play c takes d5 and black responds with knight takes d5, if black goes down the line d takes c4, it's possible that this knight would be much happier on the f5 square than on the f6 square. So that's something to think about. C takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2, castles, f4 immediately, and black goes c6, just trying to clog up the long diagonal. As support d5, everyone knows that against an isolated pawn, usually what you want to do is ensure first that the player with the isolated pawn cannot push it or get rid of it. A lot of times people say put a knight on d5. If it's an isolated d-pawn, it's the best piece to place in front of an isolated pawn. I think that's a little bit rigid, but it is a reasonable general rule. And so black just overprotects the d5 square. White castles, and this is the position in question. So take a second, think about all of the options available to both players. It's black to move. Look at all the checks, captures, threats. Assimilate a list of candidate moves and decide based on the imbalances in the position. Pawn structure, this isolated pawn, this strong light squared bishop, this weak d4 pawn, etc. Try and formulate a plan and a move for black. Okay. In the game, so I was posed this position, and it took a little bit of prodding for me to find the right move. The most obvious moves in the position are, I think, something like knight to a6 or knight to d7. Knight to d7, probably intending to go, let's say, knight to f6 and overprotect this knight on d5, or possibly go maybe knight takes c3 and then rook c8, c5, etc. Just blowing everything open. Knight a6 is similar. The only really constructive thing I can think that knight a6 does is that the second knight is going to c7. Again, sort of just a different square to support the knight on d5. The one problem with a move like knight d7, let's say, is that after knight takes d5, and let's just say c takes d5, it's a more sensible capture, black no longer has the d5 outposts for a knight and no longer has the pressure on the Isolani along the d line. And for the most part, white doesn't have very many problems if you allow him to capture on d5. For instance, rook a to c1, knight to f6, and rook f to e1, when it's even possible that because this bishop is not particularly good on g2 anymore, so-called biting on granite, hate that. I think that's a Nimzo thing. It's possible for white to go bishop f1 to d3 and then start to try and get rid of at least one of the f-pawns and inflict some structural weaknesses on black with the f5 break. So that's one problem with going with the somewhat lackadaisical development move, knight d7, knight a6. They both allow knight takes d5. The second thing is they might also just allow f5 immediately. That's one idea that white has, even as a pawn sacrifice. You could imagine that if white goes f5, after e takes f5, knight takes d5, c takes d5, black has weaknesses on f5 and d5, somewhat uncomfortable. And so you start to think about these things like white is threatening f5. Could we stop that? White, we're sort of reluctant to allow knight takes d5 because it probably is going to relieve some pressure on the Isolani. And maybe that might start to frame your decision a little bit on the correct move in this position. So if you want to, if you're not getting the strong hints that I require to figure out the correct move in this position, take another couple minutes and see if you can find the move. Okay. The correct move is knight to e7. Exclam. Stopping both of white's ideas in one fell swoop and also getting ready for the final assault on this weak d-pawn. And when I was shown this game, I sort of remembered this famous quote from, I think it's attributed to Bent Larson. I'm not sure I've actually seen it in print. The man on my wall up there, in fact, that what was the approximate quote is that I don't, quote unquote, I don't want to blockade an isolated pawn, I want to capture it. And there is, and this is one of the reasons why I say maybe always putting a knight in front of the isolated pawn is a little bit rigid, because at least in my experience, I've found that it's good for a while, and then a lot of times you end up wanting to move it and relocate it to a square that actually you can capture, that actually attacks the isolated pawn. And the point is that in this position, it's also, d5 is never going to happen. The pawn is well blockaded at this point, and instead of continuing to overprotect the d5 square, it's time to regroup and start attacking the d4 pawn. You're past the blockading sort of section of the plan and onto the destroying part of the plan. And so knight to e7 opens up the d-file. White is going to go something like queen d7 or queen d6, rook d8, knight f5, and all of a sudden all of the knights, all of black's pieces are going to be well trained on the d-file. And this position actually, after rook a to c1, will lead us into my next Zwischen, I'm changing the name. The third video. It's happening. Get ready. For now, signing off. I need to go to bed. Bye, guys.